Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Chapter 1, Part 2. It was 12 when Francie got home. Mama came in soon after with her broom and pail, which she banged into a corner with that final bang which meant that they wouldn't be touched again until Monday. Mama was 29. She had black hair and brown eyes and was quick with her hands. She had a nice shape, too. She worked as a janitress and kept 3 tenement houses clean. Who would ever believe that Mama scrubbed floors to make a living for the 4 of them? She was so pretty and slight and vivid and always bubbling over with intensity and fun, even though her hands were red and cracked from the sodaed water. They were beautifully shaped with lovely curved oval nails. Everyone said that it was a pity that a slight pretty woman like Katie Nolan had to go out scrubbing floors. But what else could she do, considering the husband she had, they said. They admitted that, no matter which way you looked at it, Johnny Nolan was a handsome, lovable fellow, far superior to any man on the block. But he was a drunk. That's what they said, and it was true. Francie made Mama watch while she put the 8 cents in the tin can bank. They had a pleasant 5 minutes conjecturing about how much was in the bank. Francie thought there must be nearly $100. Mama said $8 would be nearer right. Mama gave Francie instructions about going out to buy something for lunch. Take 8 cents from the cracked cup and get a quarter loaf of Jew rye bread and see that it's fresh. Then take a nickel, go to Ch1 and ask for the end of the tongue for a nickel. But you have to have a pull with him to get it. Tell him that your mother said, insisted Katie firmly. She thought something over. I wonder whether we ought to buy 5 cents worth of sugar buns or put that money in the bank. Oh, Mama, it's Saturday. All week you said we could have dessert on Saturday. All right, get the buns. The little Jewish delicatessen was full of Christians buying Jew rye bread. She watched the man push her quarter loaf into a paper bag, with its crisp, wonderful crisp yet tender crust and floury bottom. It was easily the most wonderful bread in the world, she thought, when it was fresh. She entered Ch1's store reluctantly. Sometimes he was agreeable about the tongue, and sometimes he wasn't. Sliced tongue at 75 cents a pound was only for rich people. But when it was nearly all sold, you could get the square end for a nickel if you had a pull with Mr. Ch1. Of course, there wasn't much tongue to the end. It was mostly soft, small bones and grizzle with only the memory of meat. It happened to be one of Ch1's agreeable days. The tongue came to an end yesterday, he told Francie. But I saved it for you because I know your mama likes the tongue, and I like your mama. You tell her that, hear? Yes, sir, whispered Francie. She looked down on the floor as she felt her face getting warm. She hated Mr. Ch1, and she would not tell Mama what he said. At the baker's, she picked out 4 buns, carefully choosing those with the most sugar. She met Neely outside the store. He peeped into the bag and cut a caper of delight when he saw the buns. Although he had eaten 4 cents worth of candy that morning, he was very hungry and made Francie run all the way home. Papa did not come home for dinner. He was a freelance singing waiter, which meant that he didn't work very often. He usually spent Saturday morning at Union headquarters waiting for a job to come in for him. Francie, Neely, and Mama had a very fine meal. Each had a thick slice of the tongue, 2 pieces of sweet-smelling rye bread spread with unsalted butter, a sugar bun apiece, and a mug of strong hot coffee with a teaspoon of sweetened condensed milk on the side. There was a special Nolan idea about the coffee. It was their one great luxury. Mama made a big potful each morning and reheated it for dinner and supper, and it got stronger as the day wore on. It was an awful lot of water and very little coffee, but Mama put a lump of chicory in it, which made it taste strong and bitter. Each one was allowed 3 cups a day with milk. Other times you could help yourself to a cup of black coffee any time you felt like it. Sometimes when you had nothing at all and it was raining and you were all alone in the flat, it was wonderful to know that you could have something, even though it was only a cup of black and bitter coffee. Neely and Francie loved coffee but seldom drank it. Today, as usual, Neely let his coffee stand black and ate his condensed milk spread on bread. He sipped a little of the black coffee for the sake of formality. Mama poured Francie's coffee and put in the milk, even though she knew the child wouldn't drink it. Francie loved the smell of coffee and the way it was hot. As she ate her bread and meat, she kept one hand curved about the cup, enjoying its warmth. From time to time, she'd smell the bitter sweetness of it. That was better than drinking it. At the end of the meal, it went down the sink. Mama had two sisters, Sissy and Evie, who came to the flat often. Every time they saw the coffee thrown away, they gave Mama a lecture about wasting things. Mama explained. Francie is entitled to 1 cup each meal like the rest. If it makes her feel better to throw it away rather than to drink it, all right. I think it's good that people like us can waste something once in a while and get the feeling of how it would be to have lots of money and not have to worry about scrounging. This queer point of view satisfied Mama and pleased Francie. It was one of the links between the ground down poor and the wasteful rich. The girl felt that even if she had less than anybody in Williamsburg, somehow she had more. She was richer because she had something to waste. She ate her sugar bun slowly, reluctant to have done with its sweet taste, while the coffee got ice cold. Regally, she poured it down the sink drain, feeling casually extravagant. After that, she was ready to go to Loescher's for the family's semi-weekly supply of stale bread. Mama told her that she could take a nickel and buy a stale pie if she could get one that wasn't mashed too much. Loescher's bread factory supplied the neighborhood stores. The bread was not wrapped in wax paper and grew stale quickly. Loescher's redeemed the stale bread from the dealers and sold it at half price to the poor. The outlet store adjoined the bakery. Its long, narrow counter filled one side, and long, narrow benches ran along the other 2 sides. A huge double door opened behind the counter. The bakery wagons backed up to it and unloaded the bread right onto the counter. They sold 2 loaves for a nickel, and when it was dumped out, a pushing crowd fought for the privilege of buying it. There was never enough bread, and some waited until 3 or 4 wagons had reported before they could buy bread. At that price, the customers had to supply their own wrappings. Most of the purchasers were children. Some kids tucked the bread under their arms and walked home brazenly, letting all the world know that they were poor. The proud ones wrapped up the bread, some in old newspapers, others in clean or dirty flour sacks. Francie brought along a large paper bag. She didn't try to get her bread right away. She sat on the bench and watched. A dozen kids pushed and shouted at the counter. 4 old men dozed on the opposite bench. The old men, pensioners on their families, were made to run errands and mind babies, the only work left for old worn-out men in Williamsburg. They waited as long as they could before buying because Loescher smelled kindly of baking bread, and the sun coming in the windows felt good on their old backs. They sat and dozed while the hours passed, and they felt that they were filling up time. The waiting gave them a purpose in life for a little while, and almost they felt necessary again. Francie stared at the oldest man. She played her favorite game, figuring out about people. His thin, tangled hair was the same dirty gray as the stubble standing on his sunken cheeks. Dried spittle caked the corners of his mouth. He yawned. He had no teeth. She watched, fascinated and revolted, as he closed his mouth, drew his lips inward until there was no mouth, and made his chin come up almost to meet his nose. She studied his old coat with the padding hanging out of the torn sleeve seam. His legs were spraddled wide in helpless relaxation, and one of the buttons was missing from his grease-caked pants opening. She saw that his shoes were battered and broken open at the toes. One shoe was laced with much knotted shoestring, and the other with a bit of dirty twine. She saw 2 thick, dirty toes with creased gray toenails. Her thoughts ran. He is old. He must be past 70. He was born about the time Abraham Lincoln was living and getting himself ready to be president. Williamsburg must have been a little country place then, and maybe Indians were still living in Flatbush. That was so long ago. She kept staring at his feet. He was a baby once. He must have been sweet and clean, and his mother kissed his little pink toes. Maybe when it thundered at night, she came to his crib and fixed his blanket better and whispered that he mustn't be afraid, that mother was there. Then she picked him up and put her cheek on his head and said that he was her own sweet baby. He might have been a boy like my brother, running in and out of the house and slamming the door. And while his mother scolded him, she was thinking that maybe he'll be president someday. Then he was a young man, strong and happy. When he walked down the street, the girls smiled and turned to watch him. He smiled back. Maybe he even winked at the prettiest one. I guess he must have married and had children, and they thought he was the most wonderful papa in the world, the way he worked hard and bought them toys for Christmas. Now his children are getting old too, like him, and they have children, and nobody wants the old man anymore, and they're waiting for him to die. But he don't want to die. He wants to keep on living, even though he's so old and there's nothing to be happy about anymore. The place was quiet. The summer sun streamed in and made dusty, down slanting roads from the window to the floor. A big green fly buzzed in and out of the sunny dust. Excepting for herself and the dozing old men, the place was empty. The children who waited for bread had gone to play outside. Their high screaming voices seemed to come from far away. Suddenly, Francie jumped up. Her heart was beating fast. She was frightened, for no reason at all. She thought of an accordion pulled out for a full, rich note. Then she had an idea that the accordion was closing. A terrible panic that had no name came over her as she realized that many of the sweet babies in the world were born to come to something like this old man someday. She had to get out of that place or it would happen to her. Suddenly she would be an old woman with toothless gums and feet that disgusted people. At that moment, the double doors behind the counter were banged open and a bread truck backed up. A man came to stand behind the counter. The truck driver started throwing bread to him while he piled it up on the counter. The kids in the street, who had heard the doors thrown open, piled in and milled around Francie, who had already reached the counter. "I want bread," Francie called out. A big girl gave her a strong shove and wanted to know who she thought she was. Never mind, Francie told her. "I want 6 loaves and a pie, not 2 crushed," she screamed out. Impressed by her intensity, the counterman shoved 6 loaves and the least battered of the rejected pies at her and took her 2 dimes. She pushed her way out of the crowd, dropping a loaf which she had trouble picking up as there was no room to stoop over in. Outside, she sat at the curb, fitting the bread and the pie into the paper bag. A woman passed, wheeling a baby in a buggy. The baby was waving its feet in the air. Francie looked and saw, not the baby's foot, but a grotesque thing in a worn-out shoe. The panic came on her again, and she ran all the way home. The flat was empty. Mama had dressed and gone off with Aunt Sissy to see a matinee from a 10-cent gallery seat. Francie put the bread and pie away and folded the bag neatly to be used next time. She went into the tiny windowless bedroom that she had shared with Neely and sat on her own cot in the dark, waiting for the waves of panic to stop passing over her. After a while, Neely came in, crawled under his cot, and pulled out a ragged catcher's mitt. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Play ball in the lots." "Can I come along?" "No." She followed him down to the street. 3 of his gang were waiting for him. One had a bat, another a baseball, the third had nothing but wore a pair of baseball pants. They started out for an empty lot over towards Greenpoint. Neely saw Francie following, but said nothing. One of the boys nudged him and said, "Hey, your sister's following us." "Yeah," agreed Neely. The boy turned around and yelled at Francie, "Go chase yourself." "It's a free country," Francie stated. "It's a free country," Neely repeated to the boy. They took no more notice of Francie after that. She continued to follow them. She had nothing to do until 2 o'clock when the neighborhood library opened up again. It was a slow, horse-playing walk. The boys stopped to look for tinfoil in the gutter and to pick up cigarette butts, which they would save and smoke in the cellar on the next rainy afternoon. They took time out to bedevil a wee Jew boy on his way to temple. They detained him while they debated what to do with him. The boy waited, smiling humbly. The Christians released him finally, with detailed instructions as to his course of conduct for the coming week. "Don't show your puss on DeVoe Street," he was ordered. "I won't," he promised. The boys were disappointed. They had expected more fight. One of them took out a bit of chalk from his pocket and drew a wavy line on the sidewalk. He commanded, "Don't you even step over that line." The little boy, knowing he had offended them by giving in too easily, decided to play their way. "Can't I even put one foot in the gutter, fellers?" "You can't even spit in the gutter," he was told. "All right," he sighed in pretended resignation. One of the bigger boys had an inspiration. "And keep away from Christian girls, get me?" They walked away, leaving him staring after them. "Golly," he whispered, rolling his big brown Jewish eyes. The idea that those goyim thought him a man enough to be capable of thinking about any girl, Gentile or Jew, staggered him, and he went his way saying "golly" over and over. The boys walked on slowly, looking slyly at the big boy who had made the remark about the girls, and wondering whether he would lead off into a dirty talk session. But before this could start, Francie heard her brother say, "I know that kid. He's a white Jew." Neely had heard Papa speak so of a Jewish bartender that he liked. "They ain't no such thing as a white Jew," said the big boy. "Well, if there was such a thing as a white Jew," said Neely, with that combination of agreeing with others and still sticking to his own opinions which made him so amiable, "he would be it." "There never could be a white Jew," said the big boy, "even in supposin'." "Our Lord was a Jew," Neely was quoting Mama. "And other Jews turned right around and killed him," clinched the big boy. Before they could go deeper into theology, they saw another little boy turn onto Ainsley Street from Humboldt Street carrying a basket on his arm. The basket was covered with a clean, ragged cloth. A stick stuck up from one corner of the basket, and on it, like a sluggish flag, stood 6 pretzels. The big boy of Neely's gang gave a command, and they made a tightly packed run on the pretzel seller. He stood his ground, opened his mouth, and bawled, "Mama!" A second-story window flew open, and a woman clutching a crepe paperish kimono around her sprawling breasts yelled out, "Leave him alone and get off this block, you lousy bastards." Francie's hands flew to cover her ears so that at confession she would not have to tell the priest that she had stood and listened to a bad word. "We ain't doing nothing, lady," said Neely, with that ingratiating smile which always won over his own mother. "You bet your life you ain't, not while I'm around." Then, without changing her tone, she called to her son, "And get upstairs here, you. I'll learn you to bother me while I'm taking a nap." The pretzel boy went upstairs, and the gang ambled on. "That lady's tough." The big boy jerked his head back at the window. "Yeah," the others agreed. "My old man's tough," offered a smaller boy. "Who the hell cares?" inquired the big boy languidly. "I was just saying," apologized the smaller boy. "My old man ain't tough," said Neely. The boys laughed. They ambled along, stopping now and then to breathe deeply of the smell of Newton Creek, which flowed its narrow, tormented way a few blocks up Grand Street. "God, she stinks," commented the big boy. "Yeah." Neely sounded deeply satisfied. "I bet that's the worst stink in the world," bragged another boy. "Yeah." And Francie whispered "yeah" in agreement. She was proud of that smell. It let her know that nearby was a waterway, which, dirty though it was, joined a river that flowed out to sea. To her, the stupendous stench suggested far-sailing ships and adventure, and she was pleased with the smell. Just as the boys reached the lot in which there was a ragged diamond tramped out, a little yellow butterfly flew across the weeds. With a man's instinct to capture anything running, flying, swimming, or crawling, they gave chase, throwing their ragged caps at it in advance of their coming. Neely caught it. The boys looked at it briefly, quickly lost interest in it, and started up a 4-man baseball game of their own devising. They played furiously, cursing, sweating, and punching each other. Every time a stumblebum passed and loitered for a moment, they clowned and showed off. There was a rumor that the Brooklyns had 100 scouts roaming the streets of a Saturday afternoon, watching lot games and spotting promising players. And there wasn't a Brooklyn boy who wouldn't rather play on the Brooklyn team than be president of the United States. After a while, Francie got tired of watching them. She knew that they would play and fight and show off until it was time to drift home for supper. It was 2 o'clock. The librarian would be back from lunch by now. With pleasant anticipation, Francie walked back towards the library.